The lightning split the sky like a jagged scar as Garrison Fletcher pressed his weathered face against the kitchen window, watching his world transform into a nightmare. The rain hammered his Montana ranch with biblical fury, turning familiar pastures into churning lakes of mud and debris. What had started as a spring storm 3 hours ago now resembled something from the Book of Revelations. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, his calloused hands gripping the windowsill until his knuckles went white. The creek that normally meandered peacefully through his property had become a raging torrent, swollen to 10 times its usual size. Fence posts disappeared beneath the brown water like tombstones in a flood. His cattle had sought higher ground hours ago, their instincts sharper than any weather forecast, but something else caught his eye, something that made his blood run cold. Near the old oak tree that marked his property's eastern boundary, a small dark shape bobbed frantically in the rushing water. At first, Garrison thought it might be debris, a fallen branch or perhaps a piece of roofing torn from his neighbor's barn. But then the shape lifted its head, and he saw the unmistakable silhouette of a horse's ears. A foal, someone's baby horse, was drowning in his flooded creek. Garrison's 63-year-old heart hammered against his ribs as he threw on his rain slicker and boots. The wind nearly knocked him sideways as he stepped onto his porch, but he pressed forward, his eyes never leaving the struggling animal. The foal couldn't be more than a few months old, its coat dark with water and fear. Every few seconds its head would disappear beneath the surface before bobbing up again, weaker each time. The current was carrying the animal toward the old stone bridge downstream, and beyond that lay the Miller's Mill Dam. If that foal went over the dam, it would be torn apart on the rocks below. Garrison ran through the rain, his boots splashing through puddles that hadn't existed that morning. The wind howled like a living thing, bending the trees nearly horizontal, and sending sheets of rain horizontal across his face. Lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, terrifying snapshots. His barn with half its roof gone, his truck buried under a fallen elm, and that tiny foal fighting for its life in water that would kill a grown man. As he reached the creek's edge, Garrison realized the impossibility of what he was about to attempt. The water moved like liquid concrete, carrying tree branches the size of telephone poles. The temperature had to be near freezing, and the current would sweep away anyone foolish enough to enter. His wife Marlo had died 2 winters ago, and his daughter Quinley lived 3 states away. If he died trying to save this animal, it might be days before anyone found his body. But as he watched the foal's head disappear again, staying under longer this time, Garrison Fletcher made a choice. That would change everything. He stripped off his heavy coat, said a prayer to a god he'd been ignoring since his wife's funeral, and waded into the killing water. The current hit him like a freight train, and suddenly he was no longer rescuing the foal. They were both fighting for their lives in the storm's merciless grip. The icy water shocked Garrison's system like an electric current, stealing his breath and sending every nerve in his body into overdrive. Within seconds, the raging creek had him in its grip, pulling him downstream toward the struggling foal. His boots scraped against submerged rocks as he fought to maintain some semblance of control, but the current was master here. "Easy, little one," he gasped as he drew closer to the terrified animal, though his words were lost in the storm's roar. The foal's eyes were wide with panic, rolling white as it thrashed in the churning water. Foam and debris swirled around them both. Bits of hay, broken fence wire, and the detritus of his neighbor's demolished outbuildings. Garrison reached out, his numb fingers brushing against the foal's neck just as another surge of water separated them. The animal was swept toward a partially submerged cottonwood tree, its branches reaching out like gnarled arms. In a moment of clarity born from desperation, Garrison realized this might be their only chance. Swimming harder than he had since his army days in Korea, he angled himself downstream from the foal. When the current slammed the young horse against the tree's trunk, Garrison was there, wrapping one arm around a sturdy branch while catching the foal's halter with his free hand. The animal's weight nearly tore his shoulder from its socket, but he held on. The foal's breathing was labored, water streaming from its nostrils as it coughed and struggled. Up close, Garrison could see it was a paint horse, probably worth more than his old pickup truck, with distinctive white and brown markings that would make it easy to identify once this nightmare was over, if they survived. The tree groaned ominously under the water's pressure, its root system already compromised by the flood. Garrison knew they had minutes, maybe less, before their refuge became another piece of deadly debris racing toward the dam. He looked around desperately, searching for an escape route in the chaos. That's when he saw it. A length of yellow rope, probably from someone's clothesline, tangled in the branches above their heads. It was their lifeline, literally. With the foal still clinging to him, Garrison worked his way up the slanted trunk until he could grab the rope. His frozen fingers could barely feel the wet nylon, but somehow he managed to tie a crude loop around his waist and another around the foal's chest. The young horse seemed to understand that this strange, waterlogged human was trying to help. Stopped thrashing and pressed close to Garrison's side, both of them shivering violently in the frigid water. The rancher could feel hypothermia setting in. His thoughts were becoming sluggish, his movements uncoordinated. Then the tree began to shift. The roots, weakened by hours of rushing water, finally gave way with a sound like gunfire. Garrison felt the massive trunk begin to roll, and he knew they were about to be crushed or swept away, or both. In that moment, with death approaching like a runaway train, something extraordinary happened. The foal, this frightened baby horse that should have been panicking, instead turned and bit down gently on Garrison's sleeve. Not to hurt, but to anchor itself to him. In that simple gesture, the old rancher found a reservoir of strength he didn't know he still possessed. As the tree rolled completely over, Garrison and the foal were thrust upward by the churning water, the rope somehow holding despite forces that should have snapped it like thread. They surfaced together, gasping and coughing, as the current carried them toward an uncertain fate downstream. 20 yards ahead, the old stone bridge loomed through the rain like a fortress wall. Garrison's waterlogged mind calculated the physics of their situation with grim precision. They were moving too fast to stop. The water was too deep to find footing, and the bridge's narrow archway would either provide salvation or become their tomb. The foal, pressed against his side, had stopped shivering. That wasn't a good sign. Garrison could feel the young animal's body temperature dropping, its breathing becoming more labored. They were both dying by degrees in the killing cold, but the horse was smaller, more vulnerable. Wouldn't last much longer. "Stay with me, little paint," Garrison whispered through chattering teeth, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the horse or himself. As they approached the bridge, Garrison noticed something that made his heart leap. A thick metal grate designed to catch debris had been installed on the upstream side. It was their only chance. Using the last of his strength, he positioned himself in the foal to hit the grate at an angle that might not kill them both instantly. The impact was tremendous. Garrison felt ribs crack as his body slammed into the metal bars, but the rope held, and more importantly, they stopped. The foal whinnied in pain and fear, but it was alive, pressed against the grate beside him as tons of water roared past them through the gaps. That's when Garrison heard the voice. "Hold on down there. We're coming." Through the driving rain, he saw figures moving on the bridge above. 3 people in bright yellow rain gear rappelling down on ropes. The volunteer fire department from Millbrook, led by Captain Vance Holloway, a man Garrison had known since high school. They'd seen the drama from the road and come running, but as the rescuers reached them, a new crisis emerged. The foal, weakened and disoriented, began to panic at the sight of strangers. It thrashed against the grate, threatening to break free and be swept away. The rescue ropes were designed for humans, not horses, and the animal's wild movements were making everything more dangerous. "Easy, girl," said one of the rescuers, a young woman Garrison didn't recognize. "We're here to help." But the foal wouldn't calm down. If anything, its panic was getting worse. That's when Garrison did something that would later be called either brilliant or completely insane. He began to sing. It was an old cowboy lullaby his grandfather had taught him, about a painted pony running free across the plains. His voice was hoarse and weak, barely audible above the storm. But something magical happened. The foal stopped thrashing and turned its large dark eyes toward him. Its ears perked forward, and for the first time since this ordeal began, the young horse seemed to truly see him, not as another frightening presence, but as a friend. The connection was instant and inexplicable. The foal pressed closer to Garrison, allowing the rescuers to secure the specialized harness they'd brought for large animal emergencies. As they worked, Garrison continued singing, his voice growing stronger as the little paint horse nuzzled his shoulder with surprising gentleness. Captain Holloway shook his head in amazement as they prepared to lift both victims to safety. In 30 years of rescue work, he'd never seen anything like it. A dying man and a drowning horse singing together in the middle of a killer flood. As they were hoisted toward the bridge, Garrison felt the foal's warm breath against his neck. The young animal had wrapped its neck around his shoulders like an embrace, as if it understood that this waterlogged old rancher had risked everything to save its life. What neither of them knew was that their story was just beginning. The Millbrook Community Hospital wasn't equipped for large animal emergencies, but Dr. Cordelia Westbrook had called in every favor she had to get the foal proper veterinary care. The paint horse, now wrapped in heated blankets and receiving IV fluids, lay in an improvised stall in the hospital's maintenance garage, while Garrison recovered in the emergency room. The old rancher was lucky to be alive. Hypothermia, 3. Cracked ribs and a dislocated shoulder were painful but manageable injuries. What bothered him more was being separated from the foal. Every few minutes he'd ask the nurses if someone could check on his horse, though technically, he had no idea who the animal belonged to. That question was answered when Beatrice Moorcock burst through the hospital doors like a woman possessed. Beatrice owned the Moorcock Sanctuary, a rescue operation for retired racehorses about 15 miles upstream from Garrison's ranch. She was known throughout the county as a fierce advocate for horses, with more money than sense, and a reputation for feuding with anyone who didn't meet her exacting standards of animal care. "Where is she?" Beatrice demanded, her silver hair wild from the storm and her expensive boots muddy from wading through flood debris. "Where's my sunburst?" The nurse at the desk looked confused until Dr. Westbrook appeared. "Mrs. Moorcock, the foal is stable, but that's my prize filly," Beatrice interrupted, her voice cracking with emotion. "She's worth $40,000, and she was supposed to be safely in the upper pasture with her mother. When the fence went down in the storm, she must have panicked and run straight into the flood." Garrison, overhearing from his hospital bed, felt his stomach drop. $40,000. He'd risked his life for a horse worth more than his entire yearly income. But before he could process that information fully, Beatrice was at his bedside, her stern expression softening into something approaching gratitude. "Mr. Fletcher, isn't it?" she said, extending a manicured hand that had clearly been scrubbed clean in the hospital sink. "Dr. Westbrook told me what you did. I don't know how to thank you." Garrison shifted uncomfortably in his hospital bed. He'd heard stories about Beatrice Moorcock, how she'd sued 3 different contractors over the construction of her horse barn, how she'd once called the sheriff on a neighbor for playing music too loud near her animals. She wasn't known for her warm personality. "Just glad the little one's okay," he mumbled, then added with characteristic honesty, "though I reckon I wouldn't have jumped in if I'd known she was worth more than my house." Something unexpected happened then. Beatrice laughed, not the polite chuckle of social obligation, but a genuine, surprised laugh that transformed her entire face. "Mr. Fletcher, that horse isn't worth $40,000 because of her bloodline, though that's impressive enough. She's worth that much because she's pregnant." Garrison's eyebrows shot up. "Pregnant? But she's just a baby herself. She's 2 years old, which is young but not unprecedented for paint horses with superior genetics. Her foal, Sunburst's foal, will be worth even more than she is, assuming everything goes well with the pregnancy." Beatrice's expression grew serious. "What you saved today wasn't just one life, Mr. Fletcher. It was potentially 2. The implications hit Garrison like another wave of floodwater. He'd rescued not just a valuable horse, but a pregnant mare carrying what might be the most expensive foal in Montana. The responsibility of that knowledge settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. But then Beatrice said something that changed everything. "Mr. Fletcher, I have a proposition for you. My ranch. Foreman quit last month, said my standards were too high, and I need someone who understands horses the way you clearly do. Someone who would risk their life for an animal they'd never met. Would you consider coming to work for me?" Garrison stared at her in shock. "Ma'am, I'm just a cattle rancher. I don't know anything about fancy horses or—" "You know the most important thing," Beatrice interrupted. "You know that every life matters, regardless of its monetary value. That's rarer than you might think." 3 weeks later, Garrison stood in the morning sun outside the Moorcock Sanctuary's pristine horse barn, still not quite believing his change in circumstances. His own ranch had been a total loss. The flood had destroyed his house, barn, and most of his fencing. Insurance would cover some of it, but at 63, the prospect of rebuilding from scratch had seemed overwhelming. Beatrice's offer had been impossibly generous. A foreman's salary that was triple what he'd made from cattle, a comfortable apartment above the barn, and most importantly, the chance to work with some of the most magnificent horses in the state. But the best part was getting to see Sunburst every day. The young paint mare had recovered completely from her ordeal, though she'd developed an unusual attachment to Garrison. Whenever he entered her paddock, she would trot over and rest her head against his shoulder, the same position they'd been in during their rescue. The veterinarian, Dr. Paloma Restrepo, said she'd never seen such a strong bond form so quickly between a horse and human. She remembers, Dr. Restrepo had explained during one of her weekly checkups. Horses have excellent memories, especially for traumatic events. But in this case, the trauma created a positive association. You saved her life, and she knows it. The pregnancy was progressing normally, with the foal due in early fall. According to the ultrasounds, it would be a colt, a male paint horse with the potential to be an exceptional breeding stallion. Beatrice had already received inquiries from breeders across the country, though she insisted she hadn't decided whether to sell or keep the foal. What surprised Garrison most was how much he enjoyed the work. Caring for retired racehorses was different from raising cattle, but these animals had stories. There was Thunderbolt, a former Kentucky Derby contender who'd injured his leg and now served as a gentle companion horse for newcomers. There was Duchess, a mare who'd been rescued from a neglectful owner and had taken months to trust humans again. Each animal required patience, understanding, and individual attention. Beatrice, too, had turned out to be different from her reputation. She was demanding, yes, and particular about how things were done, but her standards came from genuine love for the animals. She'd spent her fortune, inherited from a late husband who'd made his money in mining, creating a sanctuary where horses could live out their days in comfort and dignity. "You know," she said one evening as they watched Sunburst graze in the golden hour light, "I was wrong about something." Garrison looked at her curiously. "Beatrice, admitting error was about as common as snow in July. When I first heard about what you did in the flood, I thought it was just heroic instinct, good reflexes and a kind heart. But watching you with these horses over the past few weeks, I realize it's something more. You have a gift." "A gift for what?" Beatrice smiled, her weathered hands resting on the fence rail. "For seeing the soul in things. Most people look at Sunburst and see dollar signs, or breeding potential. You look at her and see a living being who was scared and needed help. That's not something you can teach." As if summoned by their conversation, Sunburst lifted her head from the grass and walked over to them. The mare was showing now, her belly rounded with the precious life growing inside. She nuzzled Garrison's hand with the same gentle affection she'd shown since their first meeting. "Have you thought about what you want to name the foal?" Beatrice asked. Garrison had been thinking about it, actually. "I was hoping you might consider Miracle," he said quietly, "because that's what this whole thing has been. From the moment I saw her in that flood until right now. One miracle after another." Beatrice nodded approvingly. "Miracle it is. Miracle Moorcock has a nice ring to it. October brought the crisp mountain air that Garrison had always loved, and with it, the arrival of Sunburst's foal. Dr. Restrepo had been monitoring the mare closely, and when labor began on a clear Tuesday morning, everything proceeded exactly as nature intended. Miracle entered the world as a perfect paint colt, his coat already showing the distinctive patches of brown and white that marked him as his mother's son. But there was something else, something that made everyone in attendance catch their breath. The pattern of his markings was almost identical to Sunburst's, as if the flood that had brought them all together had somehow been written into his genetic code. Garrison stood outside the stall, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he watched the newborn colt struggle to his feet for the first time. Sunburst nickered softly to her baby, encouraging him with the same gentle patience she'd always shown. When Miracle finally stood, wobbly but determined, he looked directly at Garrison with eyes that seemed impossibly wise for a creature only minutes old. "Well, I'll be damned," whispered Beatrice, who was standing beside him. "It's like he knows you." Over the following weeks, it became clear that Miracle had inherited more than just his mother's markings. He showed the same remarkable connection to Garrison that Sunburst had displayed since their rescue. When the colt was old enough for his first walks outside the stall, he would follow Garrison around the paddock like a devoted dog, never straying more than a few feet from the man who had saved his mother's life. The horse community took notice. Buyers came from as far away as California and Kentucky to see the Miracle colt, offering sums that made Garrison's head spin. But Beatrice turned them all away with polite but firm refusals. "Why?" Garrison asked her one evening as they watched Miracle play in the paddock. "That last offer was more money than I'll see in my lifetime." Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, then smiled. "Because some things aren't for sale, Garrison. This colt isn't just valuable because of his bloodline or his potential in the show ring. He's valuable because of his story, because of what he represents, which is hope, courage. The idea that sometimes when you risk everything for someone else, the universe has a way of giving back more than you ever expected." As if to illustrate her point, Miracle trotted over to where they stood at the fence. The young colt had grown into a magnificent animal, his coat gleaming in the setting sun. But more than his physical beauty, there was something in his eyes, an intelligence and gentleness that reminded Garrison of his mother. 3 months later, Beatrice made an announcement that shocked everyone who knew her. She was donating the Moorcock Sanctuary to the state of Montana, with the provision that it would operate as a permanent rescue facility for horses in need. She would retain ownership of Sunburst and Miracle, but everything else would be used to help animals that had nowhere else to go. "I'm getting old," she explained to the gathered reporters and officials. "I want to make sure this place continues to serve its purpose long after I'm gone. And I want Garrison Fletcher to be the sanctuary's first permanent director." Garrison almost protested. He still thought of himself as just a cattle rancher who'd gotten lucky. But then he looked at Sunburst and Miracle, standing together in their paddock like living proof that miracles were possible. The mare who'd nearly drowned in a spring flood had become the mother of what experts were already calling one of the most promising young stallions in the country. Her son would carry on not just her bloodline, but the story of courage and compassion that had brought them all together. Years later, when people asked Garrison about that terrible day in the flood, he would always smile and point toward the paddock where Miracle grazed with his mother. "Sometimes," he'd say, "the best things in life come from the moments when you stop thinking about yourself and start thinking about someone else who needs help." The Moorcock Sanctuary, now officially renamed the Miracle Horse Sanctuary, became one of the most respected rescue facilities in the American West. Garrison Fletcher, former cattle rancher turned sanctuary director, never did learn to speak fancy words about equine genetics or bloodlines, but he understood something more important. Every life was worth saving, and sometimes when you were willing to risk everything for another being, the universe had a way of making sure everyone came out ahead. Sunburst lived to be 28 years old, producing 6 more foals over her lifetime, each one carrying a piece of the miracle that had started in a Montana flood. Miracle himself became a champion show horse and later one of the most sought-after breeding stallions in the country, but he never forgot the man who had saved his mother's life before he was even born. And Garrison Fletcher, who had once thought his best days were behind him, discovered that sometimes the most important chapter of your life doesn't begin until you're willing to jump into the deep water to save someone else.